Hello again, welcome back to this tutorial series. And in this tutorial, I'm going to go over different aspects of classes that we didn't cover in the previous tutorial. And the first thing I'm going to cover in this tutorial is namespaces. And typically a namespace is the naming convention that you want to use and where you want to incorporate your class file or your custom DLL. So in this case, you see these using statements at the top saying using system, or using system collections.generic or system.web. These are different namespaces in ASP.NET. Typically, most of these that come default in a class file or in an ASPX page. And what you want to know from these is that you're using those custom libraries to incorporate different code from the ASP.NET libraries in your code. So this allows you to have access to those different libraries and incorporate those classes into your existing class. So typically what you do with your class file is institute your own namespace. So in this case, I'm going to create my own namespace for my first class file is namespace first class me, right? Then I'm going to put around it some surrounding tags. That's my first namespace. Just Control S, and this is my first class. So to incorporate this, and one thing I remember, I'll explain to you that in ASP.NET website you must put your C# classes in this file, in this app code folder. It will not incorporate that namespace, or when it runs dynamically at runtime, if you want it to be compiled right, you may have some issues if you leave it in separate subfolders. Just for this tutorial, I'm leaving it in this subfolder so you have access to it. But just remember to have your class files run under the app code folder. If you don't want to have this kind of setup, I would suggest running an ASP.NET web application. It doesn't matter where you place it, it all dynamically gets run in the binary folder at runtime. So that's something to consider. In this case, now if you look at the structure of our class file, we have the namespace we're in, our first public class, and in this one we have a constructor. This is our default constructor, and what the constructor is, it's when this class is called first as used as an object in maybe let's say a separate class or separate ASPX page, it will default when you call that object call this custom constructor. So this constructor has nothing being called from it, but there's a lot of things we could do with it. We could pass variables into this constructor, or we can create a separate custom constructor. So for example, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to create a variable, and one shortcut you can do in Visual Studio is if you type prop, P-R-O-P, and then press tab, look what you get. It automatically creates let me put this in the class actually. Excuse me. So let's go ahead and type that again. You don't want to put in the namespace, you want to put in the class itself. So let's go prop, tab, and I have my first variable. And what it does is it gets and sets that variable, and then when I use it later, I could be able to access this. And it's a public property, which means that this variable can be accessed anywhere within my web application or globally anywhere. So in a lot of cases you might want to set it to private, and then when you institute methods, then you'll set the method to public but the variable's private because you don't want to manipulate them. But in this case, this is just an example. So I have a public one, it's an integer, and let's change this to what the value is. Let's say first int, right? So now I'm getting and setting that value. Now let's create another one. So what I'll do is I'll type prop, tab, it's public. Let's make this a string instead. And then I'm going to say first string, right? Just a few more. So let's do the same thing. Prop, tab. Let's make this one a double. An integer, remember, is just one int, and it rounds like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. A double can be, to certain decimal points, it's more precise. So I'm just doing this for, so we can just see what they look like. So first double, right? And let's do prompt tab. And then let's make this a char. And then a char is typically one character. It could be A, B, C, or D, or any value related to alphabet or something like that, but it's only one specific one. So let's say first character, right? So we have all of our variables declared, and typically what you use with variables in class files is that you will set them to whatever you want to manipulate in your class constructor, or typically what they're used is in your methods. And typically what you do in ASP.NET Web Forms application is that in your event model, you will call and set call a custom class file through an object, and then you will set those variable values to maybe an ASP server control or HTML control, and strongly type those values and pass them through your specific methods. But now, in this case, my first constructor doesn't pass any of these values, right? But let's say I want to institute a different constructor. So in this case, watch what I can do. So I have this, and let's say this is my second constructor. So I'm going to put int first as my first parameter, and then let's put string second as my second parameter. Let's say we got a double, so double third, right? And then char fourth. And then what we can do from there is that we can set these values. So we can say first equal to first int. And so what we're doing is we're setting the local parameter in the constructor to the global variable here. And that's the point, is that we want to set our parameters to the variables that we set globally, so that they can be reused throughout the custom code. And then when this constructor first, what you can do essentially when you call it as an object is set those values and those variables globally to each parameter. Then it can be reused after you call this constructor within your other custom methods. So you pass it in the first time. So let's go ahead and set the second one. Second equals first string, right? And then we got third equals first double. And notice this, that each one of these types, integer, string, double, char, they have to match the values here that you're passing. If, for example, I was going to put this, oh, excuse me, let's say I was going to put this here. Watch what happens. All right. So third is a double. I think that's a bad example. So let's actually do this. Second is a string. And I don't know why it's not giving me the error. Let's rebuild this class file. Okay, so it's not. Okay, so then let's go. Typically what happens is that when you set, let's say, a string value, the second string value to the first, it will cause an error issue saying that, it's the type does not match. So that's something to consider, is make sure that these types match the values here. So when you're passing in first int, make sure it's to the first here, right? Or another thing you could do is this. Let's see if we set this up first. That's another way to doing it, to set that parameter. This says it's this specific parameter. And then let's do the last one. This dot fourth equals first char. All right. And then we have our class file. So before I end this tutorial, let me kind of show you what we did. We created our first namespace and we named it first class me. Like I said, remember that when we actually start compiling and running some code later, I'm going to move this first class file into my app code folder so it runs dynamically at runtime. Then I declared some variables. Remember, you can have the shortcut if you type prop, tab, and then it will automatically get and set that variable for you that you can reuse throughout these, different your different constructors or your methods or whatever. So once we have that, we set different types for integer, string, double, and char. We have our first constructor that comes default with this class file, that once this class file is implemented as an object, it will look for the default constructor in this case. Or you can change that and have multiple constructors like I did. I created another constructor in this one. If you look at it, it's the same title as the class, first class, but I'm passing parameters inside of that constructor, and I'm setting my global variables here, which are public, to each one of my parameters so that they can be reused throughout the different implementations of this class file. So if I call this constructor, for example, then I can call different methods on that constructor and reuse the values that are passed from my custom code, whether if I'm implementing it just in the class itself or some ASPX pages. And typically what you'll do is you'll pass your server control values to these different parameters so they can be reused, whether you're trying to write out a message or pulling information from a server control, doing some custom SQL statements. That's typically the implementation of this. In the next tutorial, I'll kind of show you how to create some methods and how we can implement some more variables and see what we can do from there. And then eventually I'll kind of show you arrays, how to use arrays and different things. And also, eventually what we'll do is we'll create a custom ASPX page, call our class file and some of our methods and set it from server controls through some click events to see how we can write information out. I want to thank you for joining in this tutorial series, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one. Have a nice day.